Thank you. Thanks. So yes, I will attempt to help you wield AngularJS like a pro. So as Ben already mentioned, this is me. These are my credentials. I work with a bunch of really smart people at a company called Union of Rad. If you want to give us your money, if you want to take our money, if you want to conspire with us to take someone else's money, talk to me or this guy Jeff in the Boston hat. And this is not because my talk is 3 slides, but because I actually want to start by saying thank you rather than finish as most people do. Because this is kind of an amazing thing that this is a thing that I would do anyway, but amazingly people pay me for it. And open source is also like a really, again, this is basically a hobby for me. So the fact that I get to fly here and talk to all of you people is really sort of remarkable to me when I sit back and think about it. And finally, how do I put this? So I also find it really interesting that I exist in this time and place where technology is this thing that's like really important to people, whereas if I'd been born like 1,000 years ago, and we're all kind of in this boat where hopefully we all are here because we have this aptitude for this thing called software. But if we were born 1,000 years ago, we would probably be a peasant working a field or a farmer. Not that there's anything wrong with being a peasant, but it's kind of amazing that I'm not, because if I was born at 1,000 years ago, I probably would be and wouldn't get to do any of this. Does that make sense, or am I just totally okay? And while I'm soapboxing, I figure I'll just go for a couple more bullet points. In the process of being involved in these communities and working with software with different groups of people, I've discovered that even though we have all this emphasis on code, it really is very much about people. So life lesson number 1, and I say this as someone who violates this bullet point on a regular basis, try to be humble. Everyone, especially in open source, everyone has something to teach, everyone has something to learn. And in those moments where you're on the mailing list or IRC channel for your favorite framework and someone comes in asking you how to build a forum, just try to keep that in mind. Also, like I mentioned, I'm being patronizing here when I say I work with really smart people because they're mostly all in the room right now. But I do, and I have the very good fortune of working on hard and interesting problems, and very often there are a lot of things that I don't know. And I say this not to make myself feel better or whatever, but I was one of the kids, and I'm sure many of you can probably relate to this, who grew up kind of being like the smart kid in class and knowing most of the answers without cracking the book open, that sort of thing. So like knowledge and being smart and having the answers was oftentimes like my refuge, what gave me my sense of self-importance, if you will. But being able to feel stupid is really, really liberating, because I can't possibly know everything and no one can. So the more you embrace that, and the more you embrace a willingness to learn about new stuff, because we're constantly inundated with new stuff in this industry every single day, it's actually a really good feeling. Finally, this industry is only like 50 years old. You take architecture or prostitution, and that's supposed to be like the oldest profession in the world or something. We still have no idea what we're doing. So getting religious or militant or anything about any one particular way of doing things, or it's not useful. And I think it's kind of holding us back as an industry. So don't be afraid to question ideas and challenge the status quo a little bit, because none of us really fundamentally have any idea what we're doing. 100 years from now, we'll be, who knows? We have no idea. So don't be afraid to try something new despite ridicule and criticism. Okay, off my soapbox. So AngularJS, just really quickly, show of hands. How many people kind of know what Angular is, but maybe haven't worked with it before? Okay, so a little less than half of you. All right, fair enough. I'll go through the simple stuff. So why I think Angular is amazing is basically comes down to these four things. Two-way data binding, which means you can write expressions in HTML templates that get updated live, and also have expressions in input elements and things like that. And when one changes, all of the other places where that data is used also change. The fact that you can write these templates with these complex dynamic expressions in a very simple way, and wire up these complex interfaces with remarkably little code compared to kind of how we used to do things, how the abstraction layers used to exist in when we were just kind of using jQuery to smooth over the rough edges of the DOM. Like now we're operating at this whole different level of abstraction. Angular also comes with this great dependency injection system, which makes it really easy to wire up very complex application logic, and also makes testing extremely easy. The philosophy of test-driven development is kind of built into Angular in its design. It also has this great module system that allows you to separate your code into kind of independent groups of features, and then group them together to create these complex applications. It solves problems for like packaging and distribution as well, and makes all that stuff really, really simple. In addition to being a framework that provides those very high-level things, it also has a bunch of these libraries that allow you to do these different things, built into the framework. It's also, as I kind of alluded to a second ago, it's a complete reversal of perspective compared to the old way of like using jQuery to take a pre-generated page and select some DOM elements and apply some logic to it. Now you're actually creating your HTML in a very structural way relative to your application. And there's also lots of new terms that come with it. Whenever you first were introduced to Angular, you're probably like a little bit intimidated, as I certainly was, with all the different terms and types of things that Angular introduces. So we'll just run through them briefly, because they're actually mostly pretty straightforward. So a controller in Angular is something that deals with a particular chunk of the DOM. It's code that drives behavior with methods and properties that can be triggered by input elements, or values that can be referenced in your templates or in input elements. Controllers always have a scope, and the scope for the controller represents all of the data and logic that are tied to the particular section of the DOM that a controller is attached to. And we'll look at some code examples for what that actually looks like later. But a controller is basically just a function that takes some parameters. And because Angular is magical, it will read the parameters and inject services into your function, like scope, which is a special one that's tied to controllers. Directives are a way to kind of keep logic that actually touches the DOM very encapsulated and away from the rest of your code. So if you've ever tried to like unit test a JavaScript application, you've probably found that it's really, really difficult because you actually constantly have to touch the DOM and all that messiness. So the great thing about Angular and its templating system is that it keeps all of your DOM logic kind of abstracted away from your actual UI and business logic. And directives are kind of an outlet for that, where for the times that you actually have to touch the DOM, it gives you a very simple, a very clean, reusable way to do that. And about half this talk is about different directives, so we'll take a look at those as well. Provider services and factories are all basically just different names for constructing objects. Any sort of generic, reusable, it's kind of like how you would do a class in PHP. And you can either define the class or write a factory that sets up the class. Same idea. Finally, filters. Filters are a way to write something very expressive when you're outputting data in the DOM, in the template. So this is like an expression that would go inside a DOM element in your page in a template. You can have a value, and that value can be a literal or a property that comes from your scope, and then you give it this pipe symbol, and then whatever filter that you want to use. and it will pass that through, and it's integrated with the Angular's localization system. So depending on the locale, it'll actually output the right currency or date or time or what have you. But under the hood, they're actually just services. So you can implement your own in much the same way that you would implement a service. And you can use them as a service in your controllers and other services. And there's also the filter, which gives you a simple way to filter arrays of objects by like matching properties. So if you want to iterate over archived posts, for example, this would be how you would do that. You'd have a property called posts on your scope, and you would pass it to the filter. So I'm going to talk about a few practices of actually designing Angular applications. And I'm not calling them best practices. These are just the practices I use. Like I said, I don't like to get dogmatic about it. Has anybody ever actually seen the movie Dogma? Okay, a few of you. Go watch it. So first of all, this is a common pitfall that I see in a lot of applications, where you just kind of have this JS directory and it's dumping ground for all these different files, which are in turn dumping grounds for things of that type. That is super dumb. Instead, what you want to do is have your application organized into functional groups. Usually you'll have Angular modules that represent individual features, and those feature modules should be able to live on their own, independent from other modules that it's collaborating with to actually create this application. So instead of this, you would have JS / the name of a module, and then cart model or cart service or something like that for like a shopping cart. You would actually organize individual things into files within the larger context of the modules where they make sense to live. Another practice that I've been using quite frequently is having the UI for your application as being actually its own app. So what I've done for all my apps recently is I'll have like a PHP backend that's just an API. And the UI will be an Angular, its own full-fledged Angular application that will live in its own separate repository and just talk back to the backend service. I think this actually flows nicely from what Ole was talking about with service-oriented architecture. This is great because you can just have all of these different services that exist around your UI and stitch them together directly in the browser by thinking of and treating your UI as its own application. Another thing that I see happen a lot is people will take controllers, and because controllers are the most directly actionable piece of code, they directly interact with your UI. Rather than refactor things into services or directives, controllers just kind of become dumping grounds for all of your application logic. Controllers should generally be around a very specific constrained part of the user interface and should maybe contain like anywhere from 5 to 10 methods. Any more than that, and you want to think about breaking up your controllers, especially if you have like an outer window and an inner window, and you have one controller that's kind of managing both. Think about breaking those controllers up into like the sort of, it's like the principle of least access or privilege, or however you want to think about it. The controller should be only concerned with one job. And you can use Angular's event broadcasting system to communicate between controllers, but generally controllers should be kept pretty constrained. Models, this is kind of a weird one to talk about because Angular doesn't actually have a model system. It has scopes, and scopes are kind of Angular's idea of models. So when it comes to actually modeling your domain logic, you're kind of left to do that on your own, which is kind of great because unlike other frameworks, Angular doesn't impose like a parent prototype or like a custom class that you have to inherit. You can just use plain old JavaScript objects, which is awesome. But generally you want to have something for persistence and for organizing your domain logic. So I have an example of one that we'll look at in a little bit. But the main thing to be concerned about here is that Your domain logic should only deal with your data, and it should be kind of away from your other services and your controllers and everything. And it should be used by those services and controllers. Finally, services are great for like when you have logic that you can pull out of a controller or pull out of and doesn't necessarily belong with a model because it references more than one thing or a series of services that are needed to perform a complex transaction. You can create transaction-specific services that bring together other services and model data and can be invoked by controllers to keep your controller code small and clean and simple. So before we get into the code, I just want to run through a few tools that I use, some of that are popular in the Angular community. By the way, I forgot to mention this earlier, but if you have any questions about any of this stuff, feel free to raise your hand and interrupt me. Is that going to be a problem for you with the mic?
That's not a problem at all. In fact,
All right.
back up about 3 slides, I had one such question, which I was wondering if I should interrupt you with that.
Go for it.
Yeah,
this one. OK.
How radical are you meaning this level of abstraction? I mean, is the PHP backend serving 0 DOM elements entirely, and all of that is happening in the UI and the app, or not?
Could everybody hear that? OK. Yeah, so to answer your question, correct. The separation is complete. The PHP backend is only serving JSON. The entire front-end application is completely static HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Any other questions while we're here? Yes, in the back.
Actually, maybe we're going to get onto it, but I recently just had a go with Angular.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the pitfalls I found was that I was trying to widgetize my page.
Mm-hmm.
I had essentially different applications per div. I had a Twitter Bootstrap. I wanted 3 separate ideas in each span.
Mm-hmm.
You've got one ng view, one router, and you should only have one ng app, and I couldn't work out how I could have them separate and still sort of, you know, in that. Somebody said to me, maybe I want controllers with the controllers, but I hadn't got the experience of how to do that. I don't quite understand how it's working.
Yeah, so the general, yeah, so the general question was about how to organize an application effectively. You're saying, so the built-in Angular router was a constraint because you only have one view.
Yeah, all of the widgets suddenly changed to the same template, and I was like, well, no, you're not that big. Why?
Right. We will get to that later.
Okay.
But as far as like trying to widgetize the page, that is a common pitfall because like everybody's kind of coming from the old jQuery way of thinking where it's like you build your entire DOM and then you go select it and add some functionality. So that is completely understandable. And like when I wrote my first Angular app, the entire thing was basically one controller with a bunch of jQuery widgets. So don't feel bad. But yeah, hopefully by the end of this, you will be enlightened. And if not, you know, you can find me and pepper me with questions after. OK, so tools. Anything else, by the way, though? Great. So Angular and the Angular community have developed a whole suite of tools and integrations with existing JavaScript tools. A lot of it is like code generation and like if you've ever seen Angular Seed, it's like the Bootstrap template for an Angular application. That's actually where that bad directory organization comes from, so don't ever use Angular Seed. To be fair, Bower is actually a really useful tool. It's just kind of a nightmare for package maintainers. It's basically like package.json for Node or you know, Composer for PHP. So that's useful and that's good. If you're super into code generation, check out Yeoman or I think Grunt even has one now. Yeah, otherwise no big deal. Batarang is an extremely useful one, Counterpoint. It's a Chrome extension that pops into the web inspector. And it gives you a number of features, one of which is when you click on an element in the element inspector, in addition to getting all the other properties, you also have this tab for all of the AngularJS scope properties that element can see. So you can see all of the immediate scope values, and then you can click on proto to get like the parent scope and the grandparent scope and so on. Also, it exposes a couple of variables in the console. So you know how you can do $0 in the console and it'll give you the currently selected element? Everybody familiar with that? With this installed, you can click on an element and type $scope in the console, and it'll give you the scope for that element without having to go from the outside where you have to do angular.element, pass in $0, and then call a scope function. So it's just a few little convenience things in that regard. Also, it shows you the hierarchy of your entire page and all of the scopes. So you can actually click through like basically your entire application as it lives on that page and see how the scopes are nested, see all the values for those scopes. Extremely, extremely helpful for debugging. Also, you have this interactive graph where you can roll over each one of the controllers and services that you have exposed. And it'll show you a map of all of its dependencies, all of the things that depend on it. So very, very useful. And probably the most useful feature of all is it does a performance analysis of all your watch expressions. So if your page is suddenly really slow, you can actually come in here and it'll tell you which expressions on your page are taking the longest to run. This was extremely valuable on this gigantic admin form that we worked on a few months ago, where it had dozens of checkboxes and tags and things. And it was just thousands and thousands of elements on the page, and we were able to use this tool to just write a couple of custom directives that brought our performance back to the realms of sanity. So I'm going to talk about AngularUI in a minute, but I'm going to toot our own company's collective horn for a minute, because we've written a bunch of stuff. So Angular file is, and these are all GitHub references, and I'll post the slides, and you'll be able to click on those links and get to all these repositories really easily. So Angular natively does not have any bindings for file inputs. Every other HTML input has like this, the ability to modify the value through JavaScript and really easily and things like that, except for files, because files are read-only, and the HTML5 file API is only available in newer browsers, which Angular 1 wasn't targeting. So we wrote this expression that allows you to have a normal ng model binding on file inputs, which is something that doesn't exist in Angular core right now. So you can write your inputs and Angular bindings as you normally would, and actually manipulate them. So this is a controller for anybody who doesn't know yet. And this is kind of how you define them. So this is Angular's injection system, where I have scope and a thing called a resource that I don't actually recommend this, but for demo purposes, it's simple. Resource gives you very naive, non-hypermedia compliant REST-ish API call ability. So you can create a particular resource to a path that's parameterized. And then you can set up your binding that the file input is going to bind to. And then you can see here, anytime the value changes, we're going to call upload and pass in the model. And then this is just to actually do the upload of the file. And this is just a really clean, convenient wrapper for the HTML5 file API combined with XHR2. So that's, file uploading 101. We also wrote another module for just doing really simple work with canvases, like the kind of thing that you would use to help a user upload an avatar, let's say. This actually builds off of the previous module, Angular file, which also includes the ability to work with the HTML5 drag and drop API. And this is an example of how you write directives. So the image editor directive is a directive that's exposed by Angular Canvas. It's a tag, that basically just wraps the canvas tag. So when Angular actually renders this out, under the hood, it's just a canvas tag. And it has some properties like fit. So like when I add a new image, it can crop it, it can scale it, it can try and fit it intelligently. Here I'm just saying fit none, so don't try and rescale it or anything. Drop target is another directive that gets pulled in from Angular file, which I can use to designate this particular piece of DOM as a drop target for files. This and these two are also directives that come with Angular file that you can use to set a hover class for when a file is hovering over, waiting to be dropped. And then drop and load are two events that are triggered, and these are just setting the state of the UI. $UI is just a custom JavaScript object that hangs off of scope and is exposed to the template. So when it's dropped, set the state of the UI to like show a class or a message indicating that the file is loading. Once it's actually done loaded, indicate to the UI that it's ready to be edited and bind it to the user's avatar. And I'll actually show you a live working example of this a little bit later. Does everybody follow how that works? Does that make sense? Yes? Okay, sweet. And again, feel free to interrupt me at any time. I know you're all very polite, but it's okay. I won't be offended. In fact, I encourage it. Another module that we wrote that's kind of specific to how we've architected our applications, specifically in the style where your UI is its own separate thing, is this HTTP auth module. As Ole was mentioning, HTTP basic auth is really convenient because it's sort of prepackaged with HTTP and you don't really have to think about it. And Angular's HTTP library is promise-based. How many people are familiar with how promises work in JavaScript? Okay, so definitely less than a third. I'm not going to show any code examples, but basically promises allow you to chain functions that get called eventually rather than nesting callbacks and having this callback pyramid of death. Everyone's seen the callback pyramid of death, right? So, right, okay, so promises are basically a way around that. It's a way to say, okay, here's a thing that represents my HTTP call. It's going to resolve eventually. I can just keep attaching functions to it, and those functions will get called. There's a success callback and an error callback, and one of them is going to get called eventually someday. And this HTTP auth module works with Angular's HTTP XHR wrapper to say, okay, if a request fails with either a 401 or a 403, don't just return it right away. We're actually going to push it into a queue, and so all of those outstanding promise resolution functions, don't actually call them yet, just defer them until later. So what we do in our application is, because the UI is all static and all of the sensitive data is coming from the API, the UI can just start firing off API requests immediately. And as soon as there's something there that requires authentication that kicks back a 401 or 403, or I suppose initially it'd only be a 401. As soon as that happens, the system is like, oh, okay, I noticed that a request has failed and there's one or more requests waiting in the queue. So what we can do is pop up a dialog and prompt the user for their authentication credentials, and then come in here and say, okay, give the HTTP auth service some credentials, and then take the request queue and flush any outstanding requests. So it'll take all those requests and try them all again. And when they succeed, all of the code that was originally chained off of those requests will actually finally get called. So it's a really, really simple, convenient way to handle these otherwise very tricky, complex problems. And finally, Angular model, which is a very simple module that we wrote just to be able to bind domain logic to like specific API endpoints. So what we do in in our HTML page so that our application knows where to look for these API resources is we actually have link tags in the header. So it'll be link rel equals resource, and then we'll give it a name which corresponds to one of these guys, and then it'll have a URL. So I don't have to actually hard code any URLs into my JavaScript. It's all coming from the server. And then by using this model library, I can actually define these models with names and have like an instance method that I can call on a specific user, or a class method that I can call on all users. So this is just like a standard, Symfony, Cake, Rails style finders, where I can pass in some query parameters that get serialized. And this is just like a convenience wrapper for finding all the active users. And because it returns a promise, I can chain a function off of that method to do something with the result. Very convenient. And I'm able to keep that logic contained and isolated around my domain objects. Does all this make sense so far? Any questions? Great. So currently, these are the features of Angular model. There are some competing like REST-ish ones out there. This isn't even fully REST compliant or hypermedia compliant. But it's, as I indicated, it's based on promises. All the HTTP calls are promise-based. Unlike if you've ever used Angular's built-in ng resource, it's kind of hacky. They fixed that recently, but not completely. It gives you a really convenient way to bind domain logic to URLs. It actually tracks as you edit fields. It tracks which fields are changed from the original version, and will actually send like a smart patch request with just the updates. It also intelligently handles errors. So for our API service, we kind of followed GitHub's model of if a request fails for validation reasons, for example, we send back an HTTP 422. It's entity something bad with the entity. And then the JSON body response will actually be like a key value map of the fields and what the error messages are. So this will handle that. Sorry? Unprocessable entity. Thank you. Wow, that was really handy. So yeah, it'll handle those errors intelligently, and it integrates well with Angular's form handling. So Angular has features for handling validation errors in a form. So you submit the form, the errors come back, and you can use them directly in Angular's form validation error handling. And it is almost hypermedia compliant. I say that because of the things that we're working on in the future, which are relationship linking and embedding. So like you'll be able to have, this thing is related to this other thing and it has a link. And when you traverse that link, you can, wrap the result in some other domain logic that's specific to it. Also for embedding, like if you have a post and then you have an array of comments, each one of those comments should be able to have its own embedded URL that you can call and get like the full response for that particular comment. Also getting smarter about URL-based read-through and write-through caching, actually respecting HTTP headers and using like local storage and things like that to cache this stuff. Because if you think about it, we're actually, because we're treating the UI as its own application, we kind of have to do these things. But that also allows us to be really smart about how we present things to the user so that the first time they show up, this stuff is cached, and then the next time they show up, or even if they're offline, we still have something to show them. And that also works well as they're navigating through the app and changing things. We can make the UI respond instantly, even as the server or the API is doing some work in the background. And finally, that brings me to message orientation, where we're trying to figure out the best way to sort of pull apart these HTTP messages that are going back and forth from the actual data that you want to persist, Because that for me was kind of like the key to understanding HTTP and how to leverage it properly, is that it's not an RPC protocol for just shoveling objects back and forth. It's actually a message passing protocol. And understanding that paradigm, and I can't really go into all of what that means in this talk, but actually understanding it as a message passing protocol is a really powerful paradigm shift. So we're figuring out the best way to allow people to say, okay, these fields are just part of the message and relate to this particular transaction that I'm doing right now, but they're not actually something I'm going to persist. So they're not actually part of my domain object in the API, or what I'm going to show to the user as something that's editable. Does that make sense? Yes?
On the relationship linking embedding, on the top link there, the relationship linking and embedding, I just wondered if, when talking to an API, whether that JSON structure is needs to be standardized in a way, whether it's like a HAL format or something. Does something there has to be standardized for Angular to work better? Right.
So obviously you all heard that, and I don't have to repeat it. Great. So yes, the responses do have to be standardized. What we are and the format that we use is very similar to HAL. The semantics are a little bit simpler to allow for more rich domain models and more sort of different ways of doing things. Because the way, at least HAL in particular, the way that HAL is structured is very constrained. So the model that we've been working towards is that any object that has a $links property is its own resource, whether it's embedded in an array, in some other response, or whatever. So if it has a $links property and a $self property within that, or a self property that has its own URL, then it's its own independently referenceable entity. Does that answer your question? Okay. So finally, AngularUI. AngularUI is basically broken up into three broad categories. The site's kind of crap. We're working on it. In addition to having these sort of Swiss Army utility libraries, we also have standalone modules that are just Angular native components like UI Bootstrap, which we'll be looking at in a second, that are completely native Angular components. We also have other modules that wrap like existing jQuery libraries or like Google Maps, UI, CodeMirror, and ACE, and that kind of thing. And so to talk about UI Bootstrap, first of all, the documentation for UI Bootstrap sort of alludes to this, but the entire library is actually basically about kittens. So you'll see that in the carousel example, which I've replicated here. You have your various series of kittens. And to take a look at the code for that, it's actually very simple. So here's the controller, and all you're really doing is defining some data and attaching it to the scope. So you have up here an interval that indicates how long the slide should wait before advancing. And you have each one of your slides. And you can actually look at how this is represented in the HTML. And you can see that those property names are all really very arbitrary, because what matters is the directives that you're using. So here is where I'm binding that particular JavaScript function to this bit of DOM. And obviously, just defining functions like this, especially global functions, is really not the way to do this. I'm just showing you the simple example for fitting on a slide purposes. So you have this carousel directive. You're setting the interval. Again, it's totally arbitrary. Like, this could be a hard-coded value, but as it is, it's just a reference to a scope value that I've organized in a particular way under an object called deck. And then in the carousel, I'll have a series of slides with the slide directive. ng repeat, again, is an Angular core directive that allows you to iterate over objects and arrays. So I'm saying, for each, it's basically, for each slide in deck.slides. Indicate which one is active. That's a property that carousel sets for me. And then I just have an image and some text. So again, it's really very much left up to me how I structure my data and how I structure my HTML. Because the directive syntax and the directive API allows me to combine these things in a very powerful way. Like, as long as I know the correct elements and attributes to use, I can combine these things in any way I want to. So like you saw in the previous example with the canvas, I'm taking a canvas element and combining some drag and drop directives with it to create this very rich behavior, which we'll demo in a second. But getting back to the cats, you can also organize them in an accordion. Again, the code for that is very simple. I'm just defining my cats, and here's my accordion that I'm defining with an accordion element, and setting the heading, what cats I'm actually iterating over, and again just dumping out an image. You can also schedule your cats, and honestly we're really not even trying anymore at this point. We're just giving it a date, and I mean seriously, this is ridiculous. Basically just specifying a date picker and a time picker. You get the idea. UI Bootstrap also wraps basically every other element in Bootstrap. They recently just released 0.10, which is upgraded or updated to, I think, Bootstrap 3.0.3. So all you have to do to get all this wonderful cat magicness is include Bootstrap 3 CSS and AngularUI Bootstrap, just 2 files for all of this. It wraps everything else that Bootstrap offers, except for the stuff that's literally just CSS. You can check that out at angularui.github.io/bootstrap. Again, the slides will be up later, so you don't have to memorize this or whatever. 5 minutes? Oh, dang, wow, okay, better go fast. Yeah, so there's some other stuff in there too. Finally, the project that I work on is UI Router. I'm gonna start talking really, really quickly. Long story short, ng-route, which is the built-in routing infrastructure for Angular 1 currently, it's crap. Don't tell the guys I said that. They're super nice. I mean, actually, I've told them that, so don't worry. So the reason why it's crap is it basically just gives you a bunch of URL pattern matchers that you can attach a template and a controller to, and they only go 1 level deep, and it's sort of useless for anything but the most basic scenarios. Whereas UI Router, you actually have this fundamentally different abstraction that exists between your URLs and the actual state of your application. It actually allows you to model your application as a hierarchical state machine. The basic features that it offers are you can organize your states in a tree, so that you have this nested tree structure that actually makes sense according to your application. With that, you can nest your view templates. URLs are hierarchical, and it also has some nice animated transition goodies. So let's see if, here we go, okay. So this is the demo. We'll see how much we can fit here. So here we're at the home page, and this is going to show us the URL, the parameters that are extracted from the URL, and the actual name of the state that I'm currently in. So I can go into contacts. That animation's looking a little rough. I see my list of contacts. I'm in the state contacts.list. I can drill down into a particular contact. I get the contact ID, see if, okay, yeah, so here's the URL. There's a way to do it without this ugly hash, but again, you can drill in further and then actually edit this. You'll notice that the edit state doesn't actually have a URL, so how nice that you can have states without having to have URLs for every single state that you have in your application. So I can go update this. And it's all very magical. So that's the gist. You can see things updating down here, the app here, and we'll switch back. And this is the tree that basically describes the hierarchy of the states in the application. So you have the root state, which is just slash when people initially show up at the application. We redirect them home. Initially to just the simple home page. And then you notice there was that contact state, contacts.list, and contacts.detail. The contact state is what's called an abstract state. It's basically like an abstract class. You can attach behavior to it or use it as a way to organize your states. And it has 2 parents, list and detail. detail is obviously the contact detail view, which shows email and phone. Then you can drill down into specific item and then actually edit that item. Questions so far? No? Yes? Okay. A couple of things that we're working on for the future are typed parameters. So all the things you saw there were simple parameters being pulled out of the URL. So you have a contact ID, and then like an ID for the particular piece of information that you wanted to edit, the email or the phone. It was just like 1 and 2. So just simple IDs, right? And then you have to figure out what to actually do with those parameters, pull them into your controller and, call back to a service or what have you. We're actually working on features where you can define a type of parameter, like this type is an API resource. And whenever I deserialize it, I'll take the name of the parameter, so I can have a parameter called users with an ID of 1, and actually put those two pieces of information together. Go call my API backend, say, give me back a user, and then once that user comes back, initialize the state and pass that user to your controller. And then finally, rich transitions. Right now, we don't, because this isn't like a formal finite state machine, you just have this tree of states and you can move from any one to any other one sort of arbitrarily. We have these events that end up becoming dumping grounds for, well, when I leave this state and go to this specific state, execute this list of instructions. So we don't really have very good management for that right now. So what we're working on is a transition service where you'll actually be able to attach events that say, okay, if you go from any one of these states to any one of these other states and this user isn't saved, then throw up a modal dialog that says, hey, you should probably do something about this. And this is an actual application that we wrote. Don't worry, Jeff, I got permission to show this. So this is a fairly large and complex application that we wrote around UI router. It shows, well, here, we'll do this. beta.pixel.com. It shows a whole bunch of movies, and then you can actually, like, let's say, Jack Ryan, that looks pretty cool. I can transition from the list of projects to like an individual project and get this nice smooth animated transition and drill down. And these are all states. So if we go into states.js. So here I have this abstract state called projects that represents both this view as well as this view. And then in my index state, which is called main, I can say, okay, assign this controller and this partial, and then once I drill in, I'm actually going to replace this entire view here with this other view that's going to show me the details for this project. So that is transitioning to this state, and I have the name of a project, which is Jack, and then I can give it, again, a controller and a partial. And then this thing called resolve, where I can say, okay, I'll take my parameters and my model, which will call back to my API and say, okay, I have a thing called projects, and we're doing this in a kind of hacky way because we have to fix some stuff in the API. But I'm constructing a URL and passing it back to the controller so that all my API logic and loading things and shunting data around is happening isolated away from the controller so that when the controller is actually doing its work, it can just work directly with the data. So what's happening here is that it's not even going to finalize the transition to this state until the project is loaded. So you can see, like, we have this loading thing here that waits till all of the things that state needs are loaded into the view. And this is actually the state that we're in. So this outer area is in projects.view, and this inner area is in projects.view.assets. And oh, this got changed. So I'm trying to find where the other resolve is. There we go. OK. So again, we're pulling. This is all just model logic that's in the state machine itself. that's pulling objects from the API for the controllers to work with. And some states use, for example, so this is like a registration state. It has a property called onEnter, which is a function that I can inject services to so that when a user comes and registers, I can open a dialog, and then when they're done registering and I finalize the registration on the back end, I can go to the index state so they can look at the projects that they came to see. And it's hard to kind of show off the structure of this code in a really good way. But basically, it just gives me a really clean way to, in one place, in literally one file, define the entire tree structure of my application. We're coming up on time, aren't we?
I'd hate to interrupt you because it's a beautiful machine you have on show here. We do want to leave some time for questions.
Oh, sweet. There we go.
About now would be a good time for questions.
Yes.
We work a lot with Angular. Yes, we work a lot with AngularUI, and I was wondering if there are some better ways to debug it, because we're using debugging tools, of course. If you maybe have some tips and tricks for that.
Debugging AngularUI itself?
Angular and AngularUI.
Okay, so generally debugging AngularUI, Batarang, which I showed, is kind of my go-to tool for that. Are you using Batarang right now? No, okay. So yeah, I would kind of recommend that because it gives you the ability to traverse your entire scope tree really easily and see all of those values. I mean, is there any ones in particular that you were having trouble debugging?
Mostly scope conflicts. So
Mostly scope conflicts.
With ng transclude and that sort of difficulty.
Like isolate scopes or just things overwriting each other?
The latter.
Sorry?
The latter is things overwriting each other.
Okay.
So we do have like different UI elements like the select and...
Yep. So Angular 1.2 has this really amazing feature called controller as, where instead of just saying ng controller equals home controller, you can say ng controller equals home controller as home, and then everything in that scope that's from home controller you prefix with home dot, and then whatever the property is. So that's a really effective way of keeping things together and not conflicting with things that are unrelated.
Right, yeah, because our reps are usually like one big directive.
Okay.
Several directives nested in each other.
Yeah, you want to be careful with that, with having a bunch of, like having your entire page be run. Sorry?
Be careful with what?
I was getting to that. Having your entire page kind of running as a single directive. Directives are very good when they're isolated around a particular DOM element or like a set of few DOM elements. So if they're your entire page, generally you'd want to look at using a controller for that instead. Any other questions? Yes, here.
So the main thing stopping me from using something like Angular would be how you handle SEO.
How you handle SEO, the classic question.
I've seen so many answers for it, and when you've got UI as your app, how would you defer that to your API to serve up some static content?
Two things on that. First of all, generally the stuff that we do is behind a login wall, so it's not being indexed by search engines anyway. So a lot of the advanced dashboard stuff where you have graphs and things flying around, that's an app, that's not really content. So in apps where you have both, I try and segregate the two as much as possible. And then in areas where they're kind of one and the same, like you have a home page that has a bunch of content and that content changes when a user logs in, like that kind of thing. There are a number of different tools to actually pre-compile AngularJS on the server using some node libraries. And you've probably seen articles on that. It's fairly straightforward to set up, but you have to have Node, you have to be running on the server. I'm working on a thing for that, so hopefully I'll have more to report in the next couple of months.
One of the things I found, I only used Angular on some of my hobby projects. One of the things I found is, for example, there's some third-party libraries I want to use that is not compatible with Angular, is it the best way to just wrap them in directive or something to use them?
Like generic JavaScript libraries?
Yeah, something, because I use the Marionette with Backbone as well, so some of the things that work with these, apparently for Angular, it just won't plug in straight away. So one of the practices is to wrap them in directives, which can be quite time-consuming sometimes.
Yeah, so two things there. I mean, it really depends on what it is. I generally advocate people that for anything that's non-trivial and not directly related to something Angular specific. I generally advocate writing like generic JavaScript libraries that are just collections of JavaScript objects and methods that can work in any context, and then providing like specific wrappers or hooks to Backbone or Angular or whatever. The worst part is when you have like these really, really useful jQuery plugins that only work with jQuery, and all the logic, all the really valuable and useful logic is kind of wrapped up in them, like stuffed into this jQuery plugin. So that's really the worst. And at that point, yeah, you can either write a directive or fork the plugin and like refactor it to actually be designed intelligently.
Other questions?
Well, I actually had one. You struck a chord when you were asking about questions for persistence and messaging in HTTP.
Okay.
So I don't know if you maybe care to expand a little on that as to why a persistent message isn't just a cached HTTP request, or
oh gosh, I don't know if I'm mentally prepared to address this without more coffee. Yeah. So in terms of APIs, up till now, we've kind of used it as just like a way to shovel objects back and forth from the UI to the database and vice versa. But yeah, a lot of the power and expressiveness of HTTP comes in, when you're actually using it as a messaging protocol. So, for example, when you think about messages, you're sending them back and forth because you want to perform some sort of transaction. So, when you're performing a transaction, let's say, a bank transfer, right? Like you're manipulating two accounts, and there's going to be some record of the transaction that's left over. But there's all this ancillary data that might be relevant to you when you're designing a UI, like how much is going to be left over at this particular moment when you're doing the transaction. But none of that data is necessarily stored. Like you'll store a record of the transaction that has the amount and which accounts and all of that stuff. But there's all this ancillary data which isn't really persisted anywhere. And as an API designer, if I'm going to get back on the soapbox, as an API designer, you should be thinking about how your data is going to be used by people who are consuming the service, not, not in terms of your database structure or, what's easiest for you as an API designer. Because if you're actually designing a service to be useful, you want somebody to be able to query an account and say, oh, hey, I have this other URL that will allow you to initiate a transaction with this account, and then post some details with the URL of another account to that account, and have this other thing that says, oh, here's a transaction that has a bunch of information that's contextual to the system now that I'm not storing anywhere that you might find useful, and then, oh, hey, here's these other links to do these other things.
It's a matter of making your messages rich enough for that particular point in time for the UI, but not to...
Right, rich for the client, and rich in terms of like this ancillary data that gets generated as part of this transaction that's not necessarily persisted anywhere. And just generally thinking about how to make your APIs as useful as possible for the consumer, not necessarily what's easiest for you. Like you should be able to change your database without affecting your API clients.
That's interesting. Other questions? In which case, I'd like to thank Nate Abele again for his talk on AngularJS at Leica Pro. Thank you very much. We start back.